All right, hi everyone. My hair's crazy. Um, I'm sorry for the delay today. I'm I'm away from New York. I'm up in Maine at my mother's house, and I didn't have enough time to prepare this weekend, getting ready for it. And as you know, I've just been in a sort of insane work hole. Anyway, here we are, and we are finishing up with, well, not, sorry, excuse me, not finishing up, but continuing our discussion of Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And so today we're picking up where we left off with the idea of the understanding. Right? And the understanding is a unique technical term for Kant um, that is distinct from intuition, distinct from sensibility, but also, as we'll see in this section, distinct from what Kant calls ideas. So, just to recap a little bit, what we saw in our last video was the transition from a discussion about pure intuition of space and time and the form of sensibility to a discussion about the possibility not just of mathematics but of natural sciences. Right, we saw with mathematics, the question is, how is it possible for mathematics to apply to nature? How is it possible for something that we have access to a priori, outside of empirical experience? How is it possible for that to also apply to and reveal truths about the external world? And the answer that we, begin seeing with that discussion of mathematics is that these principles, these laws that govern the external world, that govern nature, are not in fact part of the external world itself, but are part of our own mind, our own subjectivity, right? That they are, these principles are conditions for the possibility of experience. Just like space and time, right, which are pure intuitions, which are conditions for the possibility of sensory experience, forms of sensibility. It's then also true that the a priori synthetic judgments of mathematics are conditions for the possibility of, if not sensory experience directly, then for making sense, understanding that sensory input. Right? So mathematics is sort of first moment where we get this all-important idea in Kant that there are these a priori, pure concepts and judgments that are conditions for the possibility of experience that allow experience to be what it is. The next moment there, after we discuss mathematics, is to discuss the natural sciences, right? And how, even more sort of puzzlingly, there can be a priori pure judgments about natural sciences outside the empirical world. And we were talking about this in the last video, right? How is science possible? How is it possible for there to be these laws of physics, laws of nature that organize, indeed, the natural world outside of us? How can there be these laws if, as Kant says, right, our external experience is conditioned by our minds. Right? What is it? How can we think this relationship between uh, our pure rationality, our pure faculty of cognition, and nature itself? Right, I think I belabored this enough in the last video, hopefully, right? But the question is, um, essentially, right, what are you talking about, Kant? Uh, that nature is conditioned by our subjectivity. Um, we observe the laws of nature working all the time. We observe them, they're empirical. Um, and so, as we saw last time, right, the beginning of the answer to this is lies in the nature of the understanding. Right? That what science is an understanding of nature. And that understanding of nature is organized by these a priori, pure concepts of understanding. That our ability to make predictions about nature, our ability to observe laws at work in nature, excuse me, is in fact, Kant says, evidence that those laws are products of our own subjectivity. That the necessity, as we'll see, of those laws is evidence that they are grounded not in external nature, in things in themselves, but are instead grounded in our subjectivity. Right? All right. So let's begin then. So for today, we're looking at pages 69 to 74 and 79 to 100. And to begin with, Kant sort of continues this question. Right? At the very beginning, he asks, right, how is nature possible? How is nature possible? And what he means by that is how is it possible that nature is ordered in the way that it is? How is scientific nature possible? How are physical laws possible? Now, I think we've seen this hopefully over and over again this semester, right? But at the heart of this problem, it's the most fundamental metaphysical problem, right? Which is that the empirical world is governed by something non-empirical, right? The laws of nature are revealed rationally. We grasp nature at the level of laws, the level of necessity, intellectually, through concepts. And we see those concepts, those laws affirmed in nature. But, and we can think of Hume here. We never see in nature itself a law. Right? For example, we know that the sun makes plants grow. Right? No one would doubt that. Right? Plants need sun. If you deprive a plant of sun, it dies. Plants, come out of the ground in spring when the sun returns, when the days get longer and it gets warmer, etc. Right? There is an obvious connection between the sun and growth. However, we never see the actual causal relationship between sun and growth. That is to say, right, we couldn't point to anything in the world and say, look, there is the sun acting on plants, right? In the way that you would, want to have a observable cause. So the fact that we know that the sun causes plants to grow comes through reflection, only through reflection. It is a law of nature that is only possible on the basis of understanding, right, of principles. So what I'm getting at, and what Kant is responding to, is that the ultimate conundrum of all experience of nature, of all experience, period, is that what makes a thing what it is, its principle, its law, is not manifested empirically. And that therefore, right, the entire empirical world is governed by something non-empirical. Now, generally, in philosophy, right, this non-empirical principle is ascribed to God, right? God is that non-empirical non-presence that makes everything that it presents itself ordered, right, and appear according to certain laws. Why do things fall to the earth? Right? Why is there a cause and effect? Because of God's will. Right? We don't see God commanding it. We don't ever see God. Right? God is one way of explaining how there can be this intellectual structure to something purely empirical. So if Descartes is pushing the envelope here and sort of making the argument that God is truth, right? That God is this intellectual structure, and essentially that's all we can know about God. Kant is going to take this one step further, and we'll see he has a fairly extended discussion of Descartes toward the end of the reading for today, where he'll say, right, Descartes makes the same mistake as all previous philosophers and ascribes this intellectual law, this intellectual structuring, to something external, to God. Kant will say, right, it makes much more sense, it's much more logical, and moreover, we can deduct that in fact, that intellectual structure is not something external, doesn't rest in God or in nature itself, but comes from us, right? What imposes those laws, what gives order and structure to nature, is the understanding, right? Is human understanding, the condition for the possibility of experience, which includes the understanding. So how is nature possible? And he says this is in fact two questions. How is it possible as appearance, on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, how is it possible formally? So how is nature possible in terms of the content of experience? How is it, in other words, that anything appears at all to us? How is it that these things in themselves are able to be taken up and ordered in such a way by our form of sensibility, by the pure concepts of understanding. So, how is it that things in themselves can become appearances, become phenomena for us to experience? So, how is it possible in appearance? And then, secondly, how is it possible formally? How is nature possible formally? That is, not just how does it become the kind of appearance that it is for us, but how, in addition, can those appearances all correspond to these laws, the laws of nature, the laws of physics? So, what is the content of nature in experience? And right, how is that content made to conform to these laws? So on 71, he expresses the idea that I was just discussing. The idea that in both cases, right, content of the appearances of nature and the formal laws of nature are produced by our own subjectivity. He writes, "The highest legislation for nature must lie in ourself, i.e., in our understanding. We must not seek the universal laws of nature from nature by means of experience, but conversely must seek nature as regards its universal conformity to law solely in the conditions of the possibility of experience that lie in our sensibility and understanding." Right? So we must seek nature as regards its universal conformity to law solely in our sensibility and understanding. The nature that follows laws, the laws of physics, the laws of biology, thermodynamics, anything that we would say in nature is necessary, is produced by the form of our own subjectivity. The laws are our laws. So he goes on. We must, however, distinguish empirical laws of nature, which always presuppose particular perceptions, from the pure or universal laws of nature, which, without having particular perceptions underlying them, contain merely the conditions for the necessary unification of such perceptions in one experience. So what Kant is saying here is that we need to distinguish between empirical laws, which presuppose particular perceptions, and pure universal laws. Right? The empirical law, which presupposes particular perceptions, will explain and give us understanding about actual existing phenomena, right? Those things that really appear to us. So, right, an example of this would be the sun makes the plants grow. Right? That would be an empirical law. Right? It is based on experience. I cannot think the sun makes the plants grow a priori, outside of experience, because I need to have some understanding of what the sun is, what plants are, right? The law, sun makes the plants grow, or, right, photosynthesis requires sun, plants grow by photosynthesis, however scientific you want to make the explanation. All of those, however you express it, right, that understanding presupposes a particular perception. These are plants, that's the sun. I experience every year that the sun brings the plants out in spring. Right? For millennia, human beings have been observing this relationship between the sun and plants. Now, all of that requires empirical content. So the particular law in question is going to be an empirical law, right? Because it's going to be based in particular phenomena. However, right, the pure universal law would be simply the law of causation. I don't need any particular perception, Kant thinks, in order to understand the law of causation. The law of causation exists a priori. And prior to having any experience, and independently of any experience, I'm able to think about and understand causation. So he gives an example about drawing a circle with bisecting lines in it, which is a little bit confusing, but let's take a slightly simpler example. We could think, all right, so I draw two triangles, or I draw one triangle, right? And when I draw that triangle, I recognize that each angle has a different value. And I recognize that we're talking about a right triangle here, as usual, right? Generally, when I say triangle, I mean right triangle. We draw a right triangle, and I observe that the two acute angles appear to be equal to the right angle. Now, how can it be that that universal principle, that the two acute angles of a right triangle are equal to the right angle, is not based in empirical observation? Kant says it's true that in this case I am observing and examining a particular triangle. And therefore, in this case, I'm testing if this triangle is, in fact, a right triangle. However, in order to test that, in order to even ask the question, are the two acute angles equal to the right angle, I have to beforehand, a priori, have a concept of equality, a concept of unity, a concept of relation in general. And so while that universal, or while it's true that in examining this particular triangle, I'm engaged in the empirical world, and the triangle itself does manifest the universal law of right triangles. In order to see that, in order to get that kind of analysis off the ground, I have to have certain concepts of understanding that even allow me again to ask the question, right? Are these angles equal? I first have to have a concept of equality. And that concept can't ever come from anything empirical. So you know, it's a very complicated idea because, on the one hand, it is true the triangle that exists has certain angles. And those angles do indeed correspond to my concept of the triangle. Right? So it's accurate, it's true to say that the angles of a right triangle add up to 180 degrees. But that doesn't mean that I am talking about triangles in themselves. It doesn't mean I'm talking about a thing in itself. It means I am talking about the triangle as I am capable of understanding it. So it's not that, again, I am dealing with fantastical objects or illusions. It's that these a priori concepts like equality shape and condition the way that I will understand the world, and that therefore my understanding of the world is based in the particular a priori concepts that I have, that human beings, or as Kant says, rational beings have. So, he writes on page 73, that which determines space into the figure of a circle, a cone, or a sphere is the understanding, insofar as it contains the basis for the unity of the construction of these figures. Right? That the ultimate sort of expression of this is that anything that requires the concept of unity, which is everything, right, has always already been structured according to a concept that is a priori non-empirical. So what ultimately then is the understanding, not the world itself, the world in itself, but rather the world as it appears to me, and more profoundly, the world in conjunction with subjecthood, in conjunction with I-hood, with the nature of being an I. And this is, I think, a really important point. Kant is one of those philosophers who you can read 1,000 times and you always get something new out of it. And this is something that really struck me in this reading of the Prolegomena, and in relation to sort of our reading of Descartes, is the extent to which Kant is really continuing radicalizing Descartes' conception of the way the world is filtered through the I, right? That when I establish the existence of the external world, I can only do so in conjunction with establishing myself. I can only know anything about the external world because I first know about myself because I know I exist. All knowledge is predicated on the knowledge of my own existence. And that, therefore, right, we could say that the I and the world are co-constitutional in the sense that whenever I constitute the I, myself, I am constituting also the world, and vice versa. That I can have no experience that isn't not only filtered through, but grounded in my Ihood, myself as a thinking thing. And that's ultimately what Kant is doing also. Right? That, he's radicalizing that. And he's saying what it means that the I and the external world are consubstantial, are of one substance, right? This is Spinoza's issue also. What it means that I and the world are co-constituted is what Kant is saying, right? That the world is organized according to me, not as an individual, not according to my whim or desire, but according to the structure of my own subjectivity as a rational being, not as an individual. And that co-constitution means, right, that the circle is what it is in reality and truth because it is co-constituted with my being, my Ihood, my rationality, right? The rationality that structures my world. So that in the triangle, we see this, the facticity, the necessity of my being co-constituted with the world. This is the point that Kant is trying to make. Right? The law that governs triangularity arises out of the relation between what is experienced and the experiencer. Just to make this point one more time. I know we're belaboring this, but yeah, never mind. All right. So the laws of nature and mathematics are on the side of the subject. Now, the key here is unity, right? And the way that I am co-constituted with the world is what unites both me and the world is space and time. And in particular, I think we'd say time, right? How is it that unity of an object is possible? The unity of this triangle. It's only possible for an experiencing being that experiences multiple impressions, multiple sensory experiences. I am seeing the triangle now, but also now and now and now. Right? So that the very possibility of applying a law to triangularity requires the duration, right, the subsistence of the triangle through time. And that subsistence through time can only be constituted through my time, the time that I am looking at it. So what unites ultimately, again, the external and the internal, are these pure intuitions that allow things to have unity, to have subsistence. All right, so moving on. The understanding, right? What is the understanding ultimately really about? Because it's important, obviously, in the sciences and in mathematics. But as Kant says, right, science and math don't need any further proof of their certainty. Right? Science and mathematics are ideally self-evident. Right? We don't need to explain why they're true. We intuitively understand their truth. So the understanding and this explanation of the understanding is ultimately about metaphysics and justifying and explaining what metaphysics is. So why are we doing any of this work? Not to provide a foundation for the sciences, Kant thinks. Sciences have a sufficient foundation on their own, but rather to understand what metaphysics is and ought to be. And he says, the characteristic feature of metaphysics is the preoccupation of reason simply with itself. We undergo this analysis in order to understand what reason is and the relation of reason to the external world. As he puts it, that acquaintance with objects, which is presumed to arise immediately from reason's brooding over its own concepts. Right? How is it that reason, brooding over its own concepts, can become more acquainted with objects of empiricism? Right? As Hume shows, if we attend to just the empirical impressions, then we get no understanding at all. Right? No explanations. And it's only through reflection and brooding over reason's own concepts that we arrive at an understanding of causation and an application of causation. So, the understanding is about understanding experience. And as we've already implied, right, the understanding organizes, and we actually discussed this in the last video, the understanding organizes experience and nature through what Kant calls, right, pure concepts of a priori reason. So reason and the understanding are separate. this is the main distinction, I think, that Kant wants to show in these sections. The distinction between the understanding and ideas. Ideas are not related directly to the world of experience as the understanding is. The understanding deals with the empirical world. Ideas can remain purely abstract. Ideas form the basis of the understanding when they are applied to experience. But ideas in themselves do not imply any understanding of the empirical world and can exist a priori. Right? Just as there are the empirical laws of understanding and then the pure laws. Right? Just as there's a distinction between the law of causation itself and the understanding that the sun causes plants to grow. Right? The understanding that the sun causes plants to grow is a matter of the understanding, whereas causation itself is a pure idea, an idea that can exist without reference to anything empirical. So he writes on 81, the distinction of ideas, i.e. of pure concepts of reason, from categories or pure concepts of the understanding, as cognitions of completely different type, origin, and use, is so important a piece of the foundation of a science which is to contain a system of all these cognitions a priori that, without such a division, metaphysics is utterly impossible. So that for Kant, the entire understanding of metaphysics relies on this distinction between ideas and understanding, right? That is, between pure concepts of reason and pure concepts of understanding. So we have pure concepts of understanding, like causation, that will order and structure experience for us. Our pure concepts of reason, on the other hand, will become a kind of stumbling block for our understanding of, for metaphysics, I should say. That the confusion between ideas and concepts, reason and understanding, has led to enormous confusion in metaphysics. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but right, I want first of all to go over the pure concepts of understanding, because this is interesting, I think, at least. So these are the a priori pure concepts of understanding that are conditions for the possibility of experience and which organize and give meaning, explain the understanding, experience. He says there are four categories of concepts of understanding. Now remember, these pure concepts are a priori. They do not derive from empirical experience, but make it possible. They are innate. That's not Kant's preferred word, right? But we could certainly say that they are part of the structure of our subjectivity and not derived through experience. So the four categories are quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So we've seen the majority of these discussed by Hume. Right? when Hume says, right, relation is not empirical. Relation is based in reflection. Uh, relation is about comparing impressions and thus can't be an impression itself. Now, for Hume, right, relation will involve also quantity, right? That unity, that size will be considered by Hume relations. Kant separates them, and perhaps for good reason. So he says the pure concepts of quantity, which we have a priori in structural reality, are of unity, plurality, and totality. That we have to have concepts of unity and plurality and totality before we can have any understanding. In order to understand the world, first I have to have a concept of unity, and then I have to apply, as it were, that idea of unity to my empirical experience. And that idea of unity will provide structure, will allow me to understand the world. Next, we have the concept of quality, or rather the category, of quality. And the pure concepts under quality are reality, negation, and limitation. Right? Similarly to the way that unity must be an a priori concept, we'd also say that reality, right, the quality of being real, is subjective, right, conceptual, and not empirical. Right? We've discussed this several times. Right? That the ability to distinguish between an illusion and something real requires understanding, requires reason. We see this in Descartes. Going back to Descartes, we were discussing it last week. How do I know that oasis in the desert is an illusion? How do I know that it's unreal? I have to have some pre-existing concept of reality and a distinction between those things. And connected to that would be the concept of negation, right? So I see the oasis. It looks as real as the desert next to it. And it's only when I go up and it disappears, that reality is negated, right, that I'm able to distinguish the reality from the illusion. Right? That negation reveals reality. And similarly, limitation. Right? Limitation would be connected to quantity and quality, to unity. So these first categories, quantity and quality, will be relatively scientific or mathematical, right? Dealing with number, dealing with existence, etc. The next two categories would be discursive. Right? Will have to do with dialectic ideas, and we'll talk about that more next week or in 2 weeks. These are the concepts of relation, which he says include inherence and subsistence. And what he means by this is substance, what Hume called the self-relation of substance. So substance, like unity, like reality, is an a priori concept that we bring to empirical experience. It does not arise from empirical experience. I never experience the substance of the book itself. I experience all the different impressions and I unify those to give me this idea of substance. I can only unify those if I, in the first place, have a concept of unity and reality that discursively uh, can be understood as the substance of this book, the substance of this phenomenon. Other relations, right, would be causality and dependency, cause and effect. Right? Now, this is, from our perspective, the big one. Right? Having talked about Descartes, Spinoza, and Hume, causation is our primary theme. So what Kant is saying here, and we've mentioned this before, is causation is an a priori concept. It doesn't exist in the external world. Hume is absolutely right? We don't see it. It's non-empirical. It's part of our understanding of reality, not part of our experience of reality. But unlike for Hume, Kant is going to say, right, that understanding is more real, or is the substance of reality. That understanding is the best we can do. It's all we can do. We can't hope for anything else. It would be wrong and impossible to try to have an understanding of reality that's based solely on impressions. There would be no reality. There would be no unity or plurality. There would be no substance. There would be nothing. That understanding is good. And the fact that it's based in the subject is not a reason to dismiss it. In fact, it is a reason to affirm it. The fact that it only exists in our understanding and not in empiricism means that it is an explanation of the only reality, the only existence that we can encounter or know. So, causation is a condition for the possibility of experience, one of these a priori concepts. And then finally, the final concept of relation will be community, right? Or the concept of reciprocity. Sort of a minor one, right? But a network of things, right? An understanding of kind of interworkings of things, the way that we would understand the body as a kind of a biological organism. You know, the very concept of an organism requires more than just unity and reality and substance and cause and effect, but also kind of inner organization, which is community. And then finally, we have the category of modality. He says the concepts of modality that are a priori, part of our subjective structure, are the concepts of possibility, existence, and necessity. And again, I think we should think back to Hume here. Hume says we never have evidence of necessity. I can't know, based on the past, that it's in fact necessary that the sun will rise tomorrow, or necessary that the next time I release a pencil, it will drop to the floor. As Hume says, all I can have is probability. So Kant accepts this, agrees. Yes, necessity also is merely a concept of our mind, but it is a necessary concept, right? An inherent part of our experience, can't be separated from our experience. And not only is necessity one of these concepts, non-empirical concepts, but so is probability, so is possibility, so is existence itself. Right? To say a thing exists implies certain pre-existing engagement with things. Right? I can say a thing exists on the basis of my knowledge of my own existence. But more importantly here is the observation that probability or possibility is no more empirical than necessity. And so to make any kind of claim in terms of necessity or possibility already implies that our reality, that empirical reality, that nature is structured according to non-empirical ideas that are born in our subjectivity, in our minds. So these are the pure concepts of understanding. These are the concepts that are required in order to have an understanding of nature. How do we, how is nature possible as content, as something that conforms to our subjectivity in experience on the basis of these a priori pure concepts of understanding, right? That, again, to go back to the sun and plants, we're only able to have that understanding because we already have the concept of causation, that the particular kind of understanding we arrive at is driven by and shaped by these particular a priori concepts. So again, that it's not that the idea that the sun causes plants to grow is relative, right? Or subjective in the sense that it's not true objectively, absolutely. But that instead, the particular way that we understand nature and the kind of understanding that is available to us is determined by those a priori concepts that we already have as conditions of our subjectivity. That nature appears and is understood the way it is of these pure concepts. Now, the pure concepts of understanding are one side of this discussion. Right? They explain why it is that nature appears in conformity to these laws. Right? I'm able to make sense of my appearances, the appearance of releasing a pencil and it dropping, only through the idea of causation. But there's this other side of the question, right, which is about the formal nature of, or I should say, the formal character of nature. How nature can be understood not through empirical laws that explain particular phenomena, but entirely abstractly in terms of universal principles themselves. For example, everything must have a cause. That it is necessary that right, massive bodies attract less massive bodies. Any kind of absolute necessary law will not be about particular phenomena, but about the form of nature. Those abstract laws that seem to govern all phenomena in toto, right? So how is that nature possible? How can it be there are these universal principles distinct from particular principles. Right? The understanding is based in, or right, about, the understanding is about empirical experience and understanding empirical experience. But the law, right, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, isn't about a particular empirical experience like the sun or plants. It applies to all things. So how is that possible? For this, Kant says, we have to think not about categories of the pure concepts of understanding, but instead the other division, right? The pure ideas of reason. Or he says, the pure concepts of reason. Right? Distinction of ideas. Ideas meaning pure concepts of reason, in distinction from pure concepts of understanding. So what are these pure ideas of reason? And how do they give us these abstract universal principles? He says there are three essential kinds of ideas. And they can be divided into categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. He says, the concepts of reason based thereupon contain first the idea of the complete subject, the substantial. So, right, a categorical idea of pure reason is the idea of a complete subject, substantial. What is categorical? Categorical means universal. Okay, so what is universal is that which is applied to all experiences, right? Not this particular kind of phenomena, not universally for the sun or for plants, but universally for all experience, categorically for experience. Right? Within the category of experience in general, certain laws apply. These will not be ideas of concepts of the understanding, because they won't be applied to particular appearances, but categorically for all appearances. They are therefore, right, related to the idea of the complete subject. So why are the laws of physics applied to all of nature? Not just particular bodies, but all of nature. Because everything in nature is referred ultimately to one thing, the subject, myself. So that which is categorical, that which is truly universal for experience, is universal on the basis of the fact that all experience of all phenomena is rooted through the subject. And therefore, that which is categorical should be understood as an idea of the complete subject. So categorically, gravity applies. Right? Gravity describes a universal categorical experience. Not because all things in themselves follow the law of gravity, but because everything that I experience categorically appears to follow the law of gravity. In other words, right, the totality of nature is the totality of things that have been experienced by the human subject. So when I speak of things that are categorically true of nature, again, I'm only speaking of things that are categorically true of my experience of nature. What makes nature universal is that it is all rooted through one experiencing subject. And that which is universal in nature is, in fact, right, that which is constitutive of the subject. The idea of the complete subject. So, it is categorically true that in nature, an effect follows a cause. But that's categorically true of nature because I can only experience nature. Only understand nature through the a priori concept of causation. Therefore, right, the categorical observation that in nature an effect always follows a cause is properly understood an idea of the subject, right? A recognition of that a priori concept of causation. Okay. The second, the idea of the complete series of conditions. This will be a hypothetical idea of reason. So, categorically, something applies to every experience I've ever had, and every experience any rational agent has ever had, any human. It totalizes experience. However, I am also able, using pure reason, not the understanding, but reason, right? Again, divorced from any particular empirical experience, I'm able to extend my reason beyond that particular experience, not just to the totality of all my experiences, but beyond the totality of all my experiences, to speculate about what might lie outside my experience. And therefore, right, I would propose hypotheses about what is outside my experience. And the idea, right, of pure reason that Kant has in mind here, this hypothetical idea, is that of the complete series of conditions. I know categorically in my experience, every cause has an effect. Every effect has a cause. I can then hypothetically imagine, extending my reason beyond experience, that there is a complete series of causes and effects. I can imagine beyond my experience that there is causation. And I can extend that all the way back and forward to imagine a complete series of conditions, which would take me back to the first cause and the possibility of the end of being. Now, here's where we get into trouble. Because now I'm not dealing with anything empirical at all. There is no content to my understanding. I have applied this pure concept of understanding, causation, to something which has no empirical content, the beginning of being. Any being prior to its being observed by a rational being. So what this means is, right, if we think about Spinoza and the idea that there must be a infinite chain of causes, and that this must lead to a first cause, a self-caused being. What Kant is saying is, you're absolutely right. We can't understand nature without causation. Everything in our experience has a cause. But that doesn't mean that we can extend that concept of causation outside our experience to posit the existence of causation, beyond our experience, all the way back through a chain of causes to some first cause. To think this is hypothetical. It's a hypothesis. This chain of causes must go back all the way. And then the third idea of pure reason is, he says, the determination of all concepts in the idea of a complete sum total of the possible. Okay, so we follow this chain of causes all the way back, and we arrive at the first cause, or the self-caused being. Right? This self-caused being, he says, right? Or he doesn't say, he implies, is the determination of all concepts in the idea of a complete sum total of the possible. The complete sum total of the possible. We, having extended this hypothesis, this chain of causes all the way back to the beginning, we then arrive at precisely this problem that Spinoza arrives at, that Descartes arrives at, that everyone arrives at. Right? That there must then be some first cause, something that, right, ends the infinite regress of causes. And this is God, right? The disjunctive, as Kant says. So the disjunctive, right, refers to that disjunction of being self-caused, right? The conceptual difficulty of conceiving a self-caused being. And so he says, the first idea was psychological, right? An understanding of the subject as the ground for all experience of nature. The second is cosmological, right? Some attempt to explain and understand not just the realm of my experience, but of all being. And the third is theological, not just to develop a hypothesis of all of being, but to explain, right, God, the self-caused being, the sum total of the possible. Now, what this ultimately leads to is a critique, as Kant says, of pure reason. And that's the title of the massive work that the Prolegomena is based on. The critique of pure reason, the critique of these pure ideas of reason, or ideas of pure reason. The critique is this, that these ideas of pure reason, when they are divorced from empirical content, that is to say, ideas of pure reason in distinction from the concepts of understanding, lead us to make errors. That when we try to apply these ideas of pure reason cosmologically or theologically, it is a misapplication of these ideas. These ideas are only good, as it were, when they are applied to empirical content. And so, when we attempt to apply these ideas where there is no empirical content, we arrive at logical contradictions. We arrive at impossible conclusions. And I think what Kant has in mind here most of all is the concept of a self-caused being, right? That logical contradiction that is a self-caused being. How can a thing both be its cause and its effect? How can a thing bring itself into being from nothing? All of these problems with a self-caused being are a result of the misapplication of pure reason, of the ideas of pure reason. We can't have understanding where there is no empirical content. So we can have no understanding of the beginning of time, right? Even that concept, the beginning of time, is misunderstood, misconceived, right? Because time begins with the subject. Space begins with the subject. There is no beginning of time in itself, no beginning of space in itself. Or if there is, we can never know. We can never have an understanding of that. Time is our understanding,